Good afternoon out there in podcast land. This is Tammy, Terrell, Texas Desert Rose here, and we've got another treat for you. I bet you knew I was going to say that, though. I've got some ladies who are joining us today, and we are going to talk about purity culture. A couple of big words that we're going to dive into hardcore, and I think we've all had a touch of our own purity upbringing and how that's affected our lives. So I'm hoping you guys stick with us, send us some messages, let us know what you think, want to know about your own if you relate to this, and even if you don't. Men too. This isn't just about the ladies. This is also about you guys. So, so we've got a couple of ladies in their 30s, one in 40s, and of course me in my 50s, and I think we'll get a nice, well-rounded idea of the different ways that we've grown up, but also the different locations. I think we've all grown up in the United States, different parts. Myself, as you know, you can guess from the name, that I grew up in around Dallas area. So definitely a Southern Baptist, even grew up Pentecostal culture. We definitely had what we call the purity culture going on, and how it's affected me in the different countries, different cultures I've lived in. Now, of course, ending up in the Middle East, and definitely has its own purity culture. So first I want to jump out there and have you guys kind of give your feedback of what purity culture means to you. Anybody who wants to start?
I'll take a stab at this one. So I grew up on the West Coast in a American Baptist church. So when we got into high school, I mean, my mom kind of enforced this too, but it was always, you save yourself for marriage. So when we were in church, we went through this purity class, and you save yourself for marriage. It's a God-created thing that's meant to be shared with only you and your husband, and nothing outside of that. And of course, it was kind of like those impure thoughts are not okay, and all that other stuff.
Not allowed. Not allowed,
yeah. And then at the end of this course, we did the whole purity ring thing.
I remember those.
Yeah, so I had a purity ring for a while. Obviously, that didn't work out, but so that was purity.
But was the goal, was the expectation that you stay, quote unquote, pure and chaste for the rest of your life? Or I
guess if you're looking at staying pure, if you're having sex within that marriage, yeah, then that's staying pure and that's staying chaste. But anything outside of that was just a big no-no. Mm-hmm. Even though, like, my parents, I knew for a fact they didn't, but there was still that pressure put on me. Especially with the church. I mean, my mom not so much, my dad more so, which is always a little interesting for me, but it was definitely prevalent growing up, and even now, because I've made comments before, and my dad will say something like, oh, that's not okay. I mean, he doesn't outright say it, but you can tell by the tone and the way he's saying things and the words he chooses.
It makes you feel...
I mean, it makes me feel... I mean, I guess it still hurts, because, I mean, you grow up like that, and then you have one of your parents kind of telling you without telling you that he doesn't approve of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. But at the same point, I've kind of grown out of that, if that makes sense, too.
Yeah.
So.
And that's part of the getting out of the teens into the 20s and then progressing into 30s, is that you become more independent, less... I mean, we all want our parents' approval, but we become less dependent on that and grow out of that and start to...
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt me as much as it used to, but a few years ago he said something that really hurt, and that was when I finally took a step back and kind of went, okay, who's right and wrong in this situation, mm-hmm. kind of thing. Because there was already a lot of guilt on my side for things, and him making this comment kind of pushed me over the edge. So my dad and I guess we are really close, but I pulled back a lot after that. So there's still a lot of guilt and shaming mm-hmm. around going outside that purity culture.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else?
So I'll say mine was kind of similar, but then it was like a flip-flop. It was very confusing growing up. So I had parents, My mom was actually pregnant when my parents decided to get divorced, and they found out that my mom was pregnant, and then they tried to stay together. So I never knew my parents together. So both my parents grew up very kind of religious, right? But I had two very progressive parents. Okay, so my dad grew up in the music industry, so he was balls out all the time. Women, liquor, and rode hard, right? And then my mama grew up seriously like Southern Baptist, Pentecostal, very similarly, but she pushed against the rock so hard that she herself was just, all three of the girls, like my grandmother had 3 daughters, they were just wild as hell. Or we used to say in the South, wild as a March hare. That's what you say, right? And that was them. So I knew growing up it wasn't right, because my nanny taught me that wasn't right. So I saw my mom one way, and then I saw everything else another way. And so it almost made me like resent my mother. It made me resent her because she wasn't the way she was supposed to be. And I never understood why she wasn't pure, which is what you just said. And I remember as a little girl not liking it. And then when I became a teenager, I grew up in church, had every Sunday, went to Bible school, you go in the summertime, you always go to every little church in town, right? You do it all,
Bible
the little
church,
felt, yes, all the little felt people on the board telling the stories, the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well then, as I became a teenager, that's sort of like when sexuality became hot and it was out, because you have to think, so for me growing up generationally, I'm in my 40s, MTV came out, and it was so like a virgin, and it was so like women became sexual. And so my mama was out doing her thing, and so she didn't pay any attention to me. So I knew right from wrong, but I was bad as hell as a teenager. But the moment I got married at 17. The moment I got married, I was the most appropriate wife. You would not believe. Very spiritual. I knew the right thing. I knew. And I think I was a lot of times looking for attention. And I'm kind of like you, where it was like, I knew that the things I was doing was wrong, but I was going to get negative attention. And that's not the attention that feels good. And there was a negativity towards sexuality that made you feel bad about yourself as a girl. And I will say as a girl, and I will say my daddy never did that to me. I remember my mom caught me having sex at 15 years old in the living room one day. I skipped school. Oh yeah, she walked in on us.
Wow.
She did.
I'll ask you the question.
And
how did that feel?
Well, it felt like crap, because instead of my mama like looking down and going, what in the world, what can I do as a parent? She called my dad, and my dad flew in to spank me at 15 years old. Who does that? Like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then, of course, she gets mad at the boy, and then she literally says, this is God as I sit here. She says, MTV was on, of course. She goes, that's why you're having sex. I'm like, no,
because of MTV.
Chick, it's not. This guy is like wicked hotties on the football team. Of course we're doing it. You're not paying attention to me. He was super cute. He looks stupid now. I mean, you go back and go, oh God, help me, Jesus. But my sexuality started way too young, and so I didn't understand sexuality until I was divorced and a 40-year-old woman, because it was wrong and it was bad and it was a way for me to get attention. Yeah. And then when I got married, I went the other way, because I didn't want my husband to feel like I was not this like perfect wife. I mean, you want to talk about a Stepford wife? I was perfect.
So what was your idea? How were you, because I hear you say bad and good. Mm-hmm. It's very dichotomous thinking. And how you were raised, and I think I definitely can relate to that. But when you say the perfect wife, what was your idea of, if you were good, what did that look like? Not just as a wife, but as a...
Well, I was the spirit. I've always been, so I was married twice. I married my high school sweetheart, and then we got divorced when I was 21, and then I married my husband that I was married to for like 20 years. And I will tell you, I did not have an orgasm until I was married to my second husband. Because you're not supposed to talk about sexuality. You're not supposed to like sex. You're not supposed to be a sexual person. It's an act. And that is truly the way it was sort of portrayed when you go to church. I mean, it's not taught that way. I mean, you said it a second ago. It's supposed to be like this between your husband and wife thing, but it doesn't say anywhere you're supposed to like it.
Mm-hmm. And in order to orgasm, you must like it.
You right, or be able to talk about it. And nobody appropriately talked to me about sexuality. Mm-hmm. I knew what the anatomy was, because they call it the birds and the bees, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I knew what a fallopian tube was, but you can't tell me about my period, and you're certainly not going to tell me what a clitoris is and why we have one of those. That's a no-no. So it wasn't until I actually married my second husband, and he was older than me and had been all over the world. He's like, Stephanie, and there's nothing about him that's Baptist, Pentecostal, or Southern. He's like, come on, girlfriend, let me show you something. And I was like, well, wait a minute here. I didn't know about this. But that's sad because I let my faith, my culture, and I think like my upbringing stifle me as a person. And I'm kind of like you. I felt like I had this pull between what was pure and right and what did it look like to be a spouse. It was to have dinner on the table. It was to look perfect on the pier. I mean, I had the perfect outfit every time he came home. I was never where I wasn't supposed to be. I always did everything just so. And that's silly.
Do you think you were trying not to be how your mom was when you were growing up?
To a fault that I even raised my daughter almost under a microscope because I never wanted her to know that, right? So I actually ended up being the youth leader in our community. But the flip of it, I used to do the sex talk with the teens. So I wanted to be open about sexuality and wanted Madison to understand her body. But I didn't want her to be ashamed of herself because that's something that I think we were kind of taught. It's like shameful, even down to our clothes. Like I'll even talk about it, like wearing bikinis or wearing like the right bra. That could be too fresh. Like if they're not white. I remember because on Easter where we come from, you have to wear your Easter dress. We had to go to Polly Flinders and get the whole thing, the lacy socks.
Lacy socks.
Honey, hush it. Yes, but when you got older, you could not wear colored hose because that is fresh. That is very fresh. And I remember going to a dance and I wanted to wear black hose, and that was just, you were obviously having sex. Like what?
And in my church, you couldn't start wearing hose until you're about 12 or 13 because it was just too young and you were trying to be too grown.
Yeah, so it wasn't even just like our sexuality. It was like our clothes, even our free time and what we did, what we watched. I mean, look at what we watched. I mean, it was just the craziest thing. But the way that I think men are, and this is definitely not against men. I mean, they're raised the way they're raised. They can sort of go and do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely a double standard.
Right, and you can run around on a football field with no shirt on, and that's appropriate because it's hot. Not that I want to be topless on a football field. You don't want to see that. But what I'm getting at is...
But God forbid we wear a crop top. Because it's hot.
Well, right.
And pat their butts like they do each other.
Right. I don't do that. I just think there's definitely sort of, when we talk about purity and we talk about the culture of it, it's not just our church, it's not just our faith.
No.
Sort
the
of
culture.
Like, it is the culture, and I think that church was the principal at the school.
Sure.
And that, it felt like you got your hand smacked sometimes there, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And that's not where church is supposed to be. And that's where you learn the difference when you grow up between your religion and faith.
Yes.
And God has you. And so I'm a full believer. And I used to run a group called Cleansing Stream where we would help women who had abortions, and that was a big deal. But back where I grew up, you would never do something like that. You know what I mean? So,
which is why many were made to disappear because they had, and the family had the shame about it.
And I'll say this out loud, and I'm not ashamed to say it. My mother was shamed, and she did do it at 16, and I do think that's why my grandmother was so hard on her and mean. My grandmother was so mean to her, and I think that's why my mom never kind of centered herself. I can never imagine doing that to my daughter.
And an ancestry of shame that is repeated, and hopefully having these kind of shows and talking about this stuff, we're stopping that pattern. You know, I don't want the shame to continue because this is a fact. There's not a lot of facts in psychology. Shame allows it to continue. Shame shuts it down, and it keeps people from talking, which is why we're doing this.
Yeah.
You guys have been very bold and brave to come on and say, hey, this is my life. This is what I didn't like about it. This is what worked for me about it. Some of it you may still believe. That's okay. I would imagine if you talk to all four of us, there's 4 different beliefs that are going to be spouted in certain areas, you know. So how about you?
So I grew up in a Baptist church on the West Coast, and I didn't even have the birds and bees taught growing up. We were only told you do not have sex until you're married. I had a purity ring. It was to make babies. And I remember we had a girl in our church who got pregnant at 15. And she was a teenager, she was getting kicked out and this and that. And I remember asking my mom, like, what the church could do for her and this and that. And she was like, nothing. She asked for this. Like, we will help the baby once the baby's born, but we will not help her.
So they didn't give her a baby shower, like nobody did anything to support her. And then she got brought in front of the church and like had to apologize to the whole community and say what she did was wrong.
I saw that for the first time too.